what I want to do today is I want to talk about what the evidence is telling us about the prevention of child sexual abuse generally and also within organizations. What do we know about how we stop child sexual abuse before it happens? And I should say right at the onset that I'm speaking here as a person who's not a churchgoer. And therefore, I think it's important to kind of point out that I won't be talking about anything that is theologically orientated. And also, I think my understanding of some of the specific challenges that you have within church settings, I don't have that insight. But what I do hope is that by presenting some of the evidence that we have about prevention, that we can start a conversation here about how we can make church settings a safer place for both children and also vulnerable adults. It feels like every week there is coverage in the media of stuff around child sexual abuse and sexual offending. And also on a regular basis, sadly, faith and belief communities are often implicated in many of the stories as well. Just over the last few days, we've seen the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I'm not going to comment on the details of this case in any way. The only thing I'm going to say about this is that we have an outstanding recommendation from the English independent inquiry into child sexual abuse about mandatory reporting, the legal requirement on professionals and volunteers who identify harm being required to pass that information on to statutory services. That's an outstanding recommendation from the inquiry, which has never been actioned. And I think there will now be probably a fair bit of energy in Westminster about putting statutes in place in relation to this. And indeed, just last week, there was an event 2 weeks ago, there was an event in the Scottish Parliament about whether mandatory reporting would be appropriate in a Scottish context. So I think we will start to see some legal ramifications from a case such as this. Some of you might have read this report over here, which came out earlier this year, The Cross of the Moment, which comes from the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University. Quite a dense publication, but there's a lot of stuff that's useful in there, which mostly comes from interviews with adult survivors of child sexual abuse within faith and belief settings. I pulled out this kind of material from the start of the report, which is it's quite old data now from the Catholic Office for the Protection of Children and Vulnerable Adults. But you can see here between 2001 and 2015, 55 priests were laicized as a result of investigations into sexual abuse. And also you can read the rest of the data there. But I think the important thing here is of the alleged perpetrators, half were diocesan or religious priests, brothers or deacons. One of the points I want to make today is that I think the research so far has kind of focused on sexual abuse that has been perpetrated by priests. And I think that's perhaps distorted the debate and discussion about what child sexual abuse prevention should look like in faith and belief settings. And it needs to be a much wider kind of conversation than that. But the research is a little bit kind of restricted in this area. But we know that there's kind of data that kind of suggests that there certainly was a problem here in the past, and maybe a problem still with us now. And indeed, if you look at the Scottish Child Abuse Review, so the Child Abuse Review has a wider remit than what was the English inquiry, because the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry looks at physical abuse as well as sexual abuse. But actually, the first 3 reports were in relation to, that were published were in relation to Roman Catholic orders, Scottish Catholic hierarchy, and the Archdiocese of Glasgow. All of that is on their website if you want to kind of look at the evidence that was taken and the recommendations that flow from all of that. So we've had a lot of activity in this particular area. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, I get all of this, but child sexual abuse is not an issue within my parish. And are we not talking about things that happened back in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s? We've perhaps got our act in order now. And there is actually some evidence to suggest that we are getting better at prevention over time. I don't want to disregard that in any way. But I want us to think about this subject in a slightly different way. So this data comes from the Centre for Expertise in Child Sexual Abuse, funded by the Home Office. And they produced a report a couple of years ago that synthesized the data that we have from violence against child studies and victimization studies in the UK, including data from the English National, I think it's the National Survey of Crime. Because there are now questions asked in that survey about whether you've ever been a victim of child sexual abuse. And what that data then tells us is that in the UK, by the age of 16, 15% of girls and 5% of boys will have experienced contact child sexual abuse. Roughly about 1 in 10 children. If you think about that for a moment, what that means is if you have a high school of 1,000 children, you would be able to fill around 3 classrooms with children who have experienced child sexual abuse. But the reason we can't do that, we can't fill those classrooms and we can't identify who those children are, is because of this, that the vast majority of children who have experienced child sexual abuse don't tell anyone at the time, and the vast majority of them are not known to police or social work. Indeed, the research into disclosures would suggest that on average, it takes more than 20 years for a child to disclose that they have been sexually abused. Now, if only 1 in 8 children who have experienced child sexual abuse are known to services at the time, we can get better at identification. But if we doubled that figure, if we quadrupled it, it still means that many, many children who have experienced child sexual abuse, we will never know about, which is why we need to get better at prevention, stopping this before it happens. But if you're thinking, actually, in my parish, there are no children who've experienced child sexual abuse, statistically, there are. And that's something I think that we all need to think about here. And indeed, my challenge, I suppose, to yourselves today is that because there have been so many debates about child sexual abuse connected to the Catholic Church over the last few years, rather than continuing to see this as something problematic, actually, are there ways of the church becoming a real social leader in how we tackle child sexual abuse, pulling together all the learning you have, all the experiences you've had, thinking about what that means in terms of healing, what that means in repair and restoration, but also thinking about what that means in terms of prevention. If actually the church could become a leader in terms of prevention, that could be a catalyst for better prevention across society. So I think that there is some enormous potential here, which is not about avoiding the past, but about learning from the past.